I arrived at 5:28 p.m., the way I always did. Winston sat at the gate until I released him with the quiet hand signal we had practiced since he was a yearling. The Dilworth Dog Park was a narrow, stubborn rectangle of old oak shade, hard-packed dirt, and one slightly leaning water fountain that had never been upgraded. I carried the same tablet under my arm, the same charcoal overcoat even in the thick end of summer, and the same unspoken brief I never committed to paper. Maintain schedule. Keep every interaction surface level. Exit before any variable could compound into something that required a response. Avery Wilde was late by 9 minutes. The variance had been consistent for 6 months, never fewer than 7, never more than 13. I knew the range the way I knew the local rules for summary judgment. I told myself the data was ambient, the kind of pattern a careful mind collects without assigning weight. Winston waited at the entrance like a well-briefed associate. Barnaby, the golden retriever who treated every squirrel, tennis ball, and moving shadow as a personal summons, came tearing down the gravel path the moment Avery's paint-flecked boots appeared. The dogs met in the center of the park with the pure, unexamined joy of creatures who had never once run a risk matrix. Avery lifted one hand in the same small, open-palmed wave she had used since March. I returned the same measured nod. The system was elegant on paper, close enough for observation, distant enough that no emotional discovery request could ever be properly served. I kept a list. I revised it on slow afternoons when the tablet stayed dark longer than professional diligence required. Reasons not to speak to Avery Wilde. 1. She might not be interested. 2. She might be too interested. 3. Any real conversation would fracture the clean 5:30 to 6:15 window I had protected for years. 4. She moved through the world on instinct and color and sudden decisions. 5. I possessed no reliable method for forecasting the downstream effects. 6. If the connection ended badly, the dogs would still have to share the same scratched rectangle of earth every weekday. 7. There was no clear strategic upside that survived cross-examination. I called the list risk management. Meanwhile, I began carrying an extra handful of the soft training treats Barnaby preferred. I started positioning myself nearer the weathered bench she favored under the largest oak. I reread the same page of a deposition summary 4 separate times on evenings she lingered past her usual departure. The list remained pristine. My behavior did not. She wore a small silver dog whistle on a thin ball chain. Most days it stayed silent against her paint-stained shirt. Barnaby answered to her voice, or to the general theory of delightful chaos, more than to any formal cue. One late August afternoon, she lifted the whistle and blew. I heard nothing, no sharp note, no frequency my ears could register. Barnaby continued his full commitment pursuit of a squirrel that had already escaped. I offered the longest sentence I had directed at her in half a year. Your system appears unreliable. Avery dropped the whistle back against her collarbone and smiled without quite looking at me. Maybe he hears it. Maybe he just has priorities. That remained the high water mark of our verbal exchange for another 3 weeks. Then came the Saturday of the fine, persistent rain. It was the kind of weather that never announces itself as a storm, only a gradual increase in the weight of the air. One by one, the other owners called their dogs and drifted toward the street. Within 12 minutes, the park belonged to 4 living creatures and a single open-sided shelter with a corrugated metal roof that turned every drop into a soft, relentless argument. I opened the tablet and stared at a brief I could have recited from memory. Avery sat on the far end of the bench, knees drawn up, spinning the silver whistle around her index fingers so that it caught the dull silver light in brief, turning flashes. She watched me for a long time. The rain wrote its quiet brief on the roof. Winston's shoulder pressed steadily against my left leg. Barnaby had already arranged himself across Avery's boots, as if the motion had been decided months earlier and the humans were simply late to acknowledge the filing. Then she spoke. "Our dogs aren't the only ones waiting." I looked up. For the first time in longer than I could easily measure, I had no prepared language, no contingency clause, no clean procedural path that would return the moment to something manageable. The whistle kept turning between her fingers. The rain kept falling, and the carefully maintained distance I had called risk management was suddenly, irrevocably, on the record. If you have ever spent 6 careful months conducting a silent risk assessment on another human being, only to have them name the silence out loud in one clean sentence, stay with me. Hit like if that silver whistle already feels heavier than a small piece of metal has any right to feel. And tell me in the comments the last time your own patterns quietly voted against the story you were telling yourself about safety. I read every one. I closed the tablet. The screen went dark in my hands. Avery kept spinning the whistle, patient, waiting to see whether I would finally answer the only discovery request that had ever actually mattered. I asked the only question that felt procedural. Waiting for what? Avery kept spinning the silver whistle between her fingers. Rain ticked against the shelter roof like a soft, persistent objection. For one of us to admit 6 months is a ridiculous amount of time to spend pretending we don't know each other's names. She told me hers, even though the side of her paint box had already done the work. I admitted I had read the lettering months earlier. She smiled sideways and said, "So you investigated me." I corrected her. I had observed publicly available information. We both laughed, the sound small and startled under the corrugated metal. That was the fracture point. After that afternoon, the nods became sentences, then coffee after the park, then slow walks past the walls she had already claimed with color. She took me to places that did not take reservations and did not appear on any list I would have generated. I started carrying a second towel in the trunk for Barnaby. She started leaving small, ridiculous ink drawings in the margins of the depositions I sometimes reviewed on the bench. Tiny foxes, exaggerated oak leaves, once a remarkably accurate caricature of Winston looking judgmental. She moved through my apartment the first time she saw it, like a weather system. A potted plant appeared on the windowsill without consultation. A bright marker turned the edge of a case file into something that could no longer pretend to be purely serious. She dragged me to an outdoor screening on a night I had blocked for brief writing and laughed when I checked my watch during the opening credits. She called my color-coded calendar the most ambitious work of fiction currently being produced in Charlotte. I answered in the only language I trusted. I read the commission contracts she was about to sign and found a rights clause that would have let the client reproduce her work in perpetuity for a single flat fee. I built her a simple invoice system so the city arts grants stopped disappearing into the general chaos of her studio. I never once treated the murals as hobbies that needed protecting from reality. She noticed. The whistle became our private objection. Whenever I began to answer an emotional question with definitions, categories, or probability language, Avery would lift the silver cylinder and give it one slow turn. The movement was enough. I learned to stop mid-sentence and locate the actual answer. Do you notice when I don't come to the park? Turn. Yes. The first kiss happened on a humid night after she finished a long wall behind a coffee roastery in South End. We sat on the low curb with our backs against the still tacky paint, the dogs asleep in a tangled heap at our feet. She said I looked at everything as if I were already preparing the cross-examination. I told her not everything. She asked about her. I said I was still collecting evidence. She kissed me anyway, warm, paint-scented, slightly laughing, and then pulled back just far enough to ask for the preliminary conclusion. High risk, I said. And? Worth continued investigation. 2 weeks later, I told her about the park. The firm had approved a limited pro bono matter, a residents' coalition trying to stop a development that would fell most of the old oaks, shrink the dog area to a decorative afterthought, and replace the public green with a privately managed amenity courtyard. I was lead counsel. Avery's whole face lit with the particular fire she brought to any fight that involved shared space. I set the boundary before the fire could travel. She could design posters, gather stories, organize the human side of the opposition. She could not freelance evidence. Anything obtained outside proper channels could poison the entire case. She listened. I watched her fingers worry the whistle and told myself the warning had been received. Most of what I'm telling you happened the way I'm saying it. A few of the smaller edges have been shaped so the feeling stays clear. Some of the private jokes and late-night arguments belong only to the two of us. But the plant on the windowsill was real. The contract clause was real. The moment she kissed me, and I answered with a risk assessment, was real. If any part of watching someone walk straight through your carefully managed distance and start rearranging the furniture is already familiar, you're not alone on the bench. Stay with me. I did not know then that the same instinct that made her kiss me before the evidence was complete would also make her decide the legal process was moving too slowly. I only knew that for the first time in years, the variables refused to stay in their columns, and that part of me, the part that had rewritten the risk list a dozen times without ever deleting it, had stopped wanting them to. The developers' community information evening was held in the glass lobby of their South End headquarters. Soft lighting, laminated site plans, free sparkling water, and the careful language of people who had already decided the outcome. Avery went because she had painted a temporary mural on a construction hoarding 2 blocks away the year before. She wore the same paint-flecked boots and the silver whistle. Halfway through the polished presentation, she stepped outside the main flow of guests and overheard 2 project managers speaking in the low, irritated tones of people who believed they were among their own. They mentioned a drainage study, internal, unreleased. The numbers apparently made the current density aggressive. One of them said the report had never been forwarded to opposing counsel. Avery texted me the substance of what she had heard. I was in the middle of a deposition across town and had silenced everything except the court reporter's emergency line. By the time I saw the messages, the event was already ending. She made a decision in the gap. She told a junior staffer she was the community coordinator attached to my pro bono team and needed to collect materials for the residents' coalition. The staffer, young and eager to be helpful, pointed her toward a side corridor. A conference room door stood open. Printed pages from the drainage analysis lay on the table beside a laptop. Avery photographed 4 of them with her phone, sent the images to herself, and was turning to leave when building security asked for her credentials. She had not forced a lock. She had not removed physical documents. She had, however, entered a non-public area under a false professional affiliation that used my name, and she had captured material the developer considered confidential. Within 48 hours, the consequences arranged themselves with the efficiency of a well-drafted complaint. The developer's counsel contacted the firm. They accused me of directing an operative to obtain trade secrets. The residents' coalition, terrified of contamination, asked me to step back temporarily. The firm placed me on administrative leave, pending internal review. The state bar opened a preliminary inquiry into whether I had supervised or encouraged the collection of improperly obtained evidence. The partnership committee suspended consideration of my name. Evelyn Hart delivered the leave letter herself. Her face was carefully neutral. Her voice was not unkind. You may be entirely clean on the facts, Liam. That does not mean the matter is no longer radioactive. I called Avery from the stairwell outside the office. She answered on the first ring, still running on the adrenaline of having found something real. I got the evidence, she said. No, I answered. The word came out flatter and colder than I had intended.
You found a way to make every legitimate piece of evidence we still have look suspect. I listed the damage in the same tone I used for reciting case timelines. The photographs were likely inadmissible and possibly poisonous to the rest of the record. The developer now had a narrative of bad faith conduct by the opposition. Source identities inside the company could be exposed. The residence group could be painted as reckless. My license itself was under review. None of it was abstract. All of it traced back to a single hour in which she had decided the process was too slow and my caution was a form of surrender. Avery went quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, the bravado was gone. I thought I was helping. You thought you were the only one willing to act, I said. Those are not the same thing. I ended the call before either of us could reach for softer language. That night, the administrative leave letter sat on my kitchen counter beside Winston's leash.
Across the city, in the converted warehouse she used as a studio, the silver whistle lay on a table among open jars of pigment, waiting for a hand that no longer knew whether it had the right to pick it up. If you have ever watched someone you love break a rule on your behalf, and felt the ground under your own carefully built life give way in real time, you already know the particular silence that follows the phone call. Tell me in the comments if you have stood on either side of that damage. I need the version without the polish. I did not sleep. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried the same heavy, unfinished quality it had held under the park shelter the day she first said we were waiting. This time the waiting had a docket number and a preliminary hearing date. I went to the studio the next evening with the administrative leave letter still folded in my jacket. Avery was cleaning brushes at the large sink. The silver whistle lay on the work table, among open jars of cobalt and burnt umber. She turned when the door closed and wiped her hands on a rag that had once been a shirt. I did not raise my voice. I used the register I reserved for cross-examination when the facts were already on my side, and the only task left was to make the witness feel the weight of them. You think breaking the rule makes you brave? She opened her mouth. I kept going. You used my name. You walked into a restricted corridor under a title you invented, photographed material you had no right to touch, and handed the other side a clean story about bad faith. You did not trust me to work the process. You trusted me to clean up after you, once you had done what you wanted. Avery's shoulders had gone still. I was wrong, she said. It was not enough. The anger had found its full shape, and I let it speak with the precision I usually saved for opposing counsel. I told her she did not love freedom. She was addicted to the feeling of decisive motion. I told her she treated every boundary as an insult and every delay as cowardice, so she would never have to sit inside the slower, less cinematic work of consequence. I told her she specialized in noble-looking messes that other people were then required to finance with their reputations, their licenses, their sleep. I made her recklessness sound like a character defect instead of a catastrophic error in judgment. I was very good at it. By the time I finished, the air in the studio felt thinner. Avery's voice, when it came, was quieter than I had ever heard it. "You're right about what I did. You don't get to decide that the worst thing I've done is the only true thing about me." I looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know who you are right now." Something behind her eyes simply went out. She reached up, unclasped the silver chain, and set the whistle on the table between us with a small, final click. "Then don't protect me." I left. In the days that followed, Avery did exactly what she had said. She retained Tessa Monroe, a sharp civil practitioner who specialized in keeping idealistic clients from volunteering for extra punishment. Avery turned over her phone, her location history, and a sworn statement that I had neither known nor approved of her plan. She admitted she had falsely claimed affiliation with my team. She refused every suggestion that I should be looped back in as a mitigating character witness. When the developer's civil demand arrived, investigation costs, alleged privacy harms, leverage over the photographs, she and Tessa negotiated a settlement that required an exclusive 10-year commercial licensing deal on the mural series that had made her name in the city. She would still be credited as the artist. She would lose control over how those images could be used, reproduced, or monetized by others. For someone who had always treated ownership of her work as non-negotiable, it was a precise and permanent cost. I learned the terms only later, through the ethics file. By then, the first adrenaline of righteous fury had drained, leaving behind a quieter and more corrosive recognition. I had been entitled to my anger. I had been entitled to step back from the relationship. I had not been entitled to use every rhetorical skill I possessed to reduce her to her single worst hour. Evelyn said it to me in the hallway outside the partners' conference room, not unkindly. A good lawyer knows how to win the argument. A good man knows when winning it costs too much. I had won. The whistle stayed on Avery's table, and the version of her I had left standing in the studio was smaller and flatter than the woman who had once spun that same piece of silver under a rain shelter and told me we were both waiting. If you had been the one holding the clean facts and the sharper language, would you have stopped at the action, or would you have kept going until the other person had no ground left to stand on? Tell me the real answer, not the one that sounds evolved, the one you would have actually spoken in that room. I drove home in silence. Winston watched me from the passenger seat with the steady, unblinking patience of a creature who had never once needed to destroy another being in order to feel safe. The administrative leave still had no end date. The partnership track remained frozen, and the silver whistle, the small, inaudible signal I had once dismissed as unreliable, was no longer in anyone's pocket. The ethics interview was held in a windowless conference room that smelled of carpet adhesive and strong coffee. Avery arrived with Tessa and a slim folder. She did not look at me when she sat. She simply placed the evidence on the table in the order Tessa had prepared, the time-stamped text messages showing I had not responded before she acted. The earlier email, in which I had explicitly forbidden improper collection of documents. Location data proving she had attended the developer event alone. Her sworn statement that she had invented the coordinator title without my knowledge or consent, and confirmation that the photographs had never reached my devices or my case file. The panel asked clarifying questions. Avery answered every one without embellishment or self-defense. When they asked whether she believed I had suffered professional harm because of her decisions, she said yes. That was the entire answer. I was cleared of any direction or prior knowledge within the week. The administrative leave was lifted. Evelyn called me into her office the same afternoon and offered the firm's terms for full reinstatement. Return to the partnership track, resume my commercial caseload, and withdraw permanently
from the park matter. The Residents' Coalition would be referred to another attorney. Any public association with Avery Wilde would be considered an ongoing reputational risk during the developer's civil proceedings. The logic was clean. I had spent my entire career respecting logic of that kind. I resigned instead. Not as a gesture toward Avery, not as a romantic refutation of the firm's caution. I resigned because I could no longer practice inside an institution that treated a neighborhood's last publicly accessible green space as an optional liability once the optics became inconvenient. Evelyn did not argue. She only said she understood the impulse and hoped I would not confuse self-respect with a strategy.
I took the park file to a small public interest firm that had been watching the case from the edge. Marcus Bell met me there with a cardboard box of neighborhood petitions and a warning. This park cannot become the stage where the two of you prove who loves harder or who atones better. The people who use it every day are not supporting characters in your story. We started over. Public records requests. A former drainage engineer who had left the developer 2 years earlier and still had copies of the original recommendations. Comparative flood modeling data the city already possessed, but had never been asked to reconcile with the current proposal. We used nothing Avery had photographed. The images remained radioactive. The underlying facts did not. At the planning hearing, the developer spoke of housing supply, tax base, and a reimagined public realm that would remain partially accessible under private management. I walked the commission through the original internal drainage findings, the progressive softening of language in successive public drafts, and the measurable increase in downstream flood risk the current density would create. I did not mention Avery. When the chair invited community comment, Avery stepped forward, stated her name, and spoke for 3 minutes. She described the mural workshops she had run under the oaks, the older residents who used the shade as free daily climate control, and the simple fact that a privately managed courtyard was not the same thing as a park. Then she said the sentence that cost her whatever narrative sympathy remained in the room. I previously tried to obtain documents outside proper channels. That was wrong. My mistake does not change the drainage data, and it should not be used to dismiss the data either. She sat down. She did not look at me. The commission voted to reject the current plan and to place the park under interim conservation review. Any future proposal would be required to preserve the mature canopy and the existing publicly accessible footprint. It was not a fairy tale victory. It was a procedural one. The developer was not destroyed. The neighborhood kept its trees and its open ground. That was enough. After the hearing, I found Avery in the corridor outside the chamber. The fluorescent lights made everyone look tired. I did not ask her to come back. I did not offer the resignation or the outcome as proof of anything. I was right to be angry, I said. I was wrong to make you believe the worst thing you did was the only thing I could still see. Avery studied my face for a moment. You don't have to forgive me. I don't know what forgiveness looks like yet. I only know I don't want the last true thing I said to you to be a verdict. She nodded once. We did not embrace. We did not schedule a conversation. She turned toward one set of elevators, and I turned toward the other. The silver whistle was not around her neck. I did not ask where it was. Some recoveries cannot be cross-examined into existence. They have to be lived separately, long enough that any future meeting might rest on something sturdier than residual guilt or residual hope. A year is long enough for a city to forget the details of a planning fight, and short enough that the people inside it still flinch at certain street corners. My new office occupied 2 rooms above a hardware store 3 blocks from the park. No glass walls, no dedicated paralegal, no partnership track. I represented neighborhood associations, small nonprofits, and the occasional homeowner association that had been outgunned by a developers' council. I quoted realistic timelines and never promised outcomes the evidence could not support. The work paid less and kept me closer to the ground. Winston still arrived at the park gate at 5:28. Some habits were structural. Avery's life had narrowed in one direction and opened in another. The 10-year commercial license meant the murals that had once defined her were now available for reproduction on everything from yoga mats to limited edition beer cans. She stopped trying to police every use. Instead, she began a series of smaller, deliberately non-commercial walls in partnership with a youth arts program, wrote tighter contracts, and budgeted for legal review the way she used to budget for scaffolding. Barnaby still collected mud like it was a personal mission, but he had learned a reliable recall. Freedom, it turned out, could include coming when called. We did not orchestrate the afternoon. The fine rain simply returned on a Thursday in late October, the same weightless, persistent kind that had emptied the park a year earlier. I released Winston at the gate. He took 3 steps and stopped, ears forward. Barnaby appeared on the path a moment later, smoother than before, but still trailing a ribbon of damp leaves. Avery walked behind him in a dark jacket, hands in her pockets. The dogs met in the center with the same unedited joy. The humans stopped a few yards apart. Avery took the silver whistle from her pocket. The chain was gone. She held only the small cylinder. She crossed the remaining distance and placed it in my palm. The metal was warm from her hand. Why give it back? Because you finally understand that a signal doesn't become less real just because you can't hear it with ordinary equipment. I looked at the whistle, then at the 2 dogs now sitting in the wet grass as if waiting for the next instruction. I lifted it and blew. No sound reached me. Winston's head snapped up. Barnaby's entire body oriented toward us, as if the inaudible note had been the clearest sentence either of them had ever heard. They trotted over and sat, side by side, exactly where the old risk management version of me would have required them to be, except now the posture contained something looser and more willing. Avery watched the dogs, then me. You spent most of your life believing that anything important had to be measurable, defensible, and proven in advance. And now? Now I think some things can only be known after you stop cross-examining them. She waited. The rain ticked against the leaves overhead. Do you still think I'm a risk? Yes. Her shoulders shifted a fraction. But I no longer think a life stripped of every unquantifiable risk is a life I want to keep building. I did not ask her to forget the year. I did not offer the new office or the preserved park as evidence that the ledger had balanced. I simply closed my fingers around the whistle and said the only sentence that felt both true and unfinished enough to stand on. I hear you this time. Avery glanced at the silent metal in my hand. You can't hear it. Exactly. She stepped forward. I opened my arms. The dogs leaned against our legs in a damp, breathing parenthesis, while the rain continued its soft, unresolved argument on the leaves. We had both been waiting. She had simply been the first one willing to say the quiet part, where the other person could finally stop pretending not to understand the frequency. The whistle made no sound I could detect, yet Winston and Barnaby answered at once. Maybe that was how the signal between Avery and me had always worked, beneath language, beneath strategy, beneath every careful boundary I had drafted and redrafted for 6 silent months. I used to call the distance risk management. I know the cleaner name for it now. We were both waiting. She was simply the first one brave enough to stop managing the risk and start telling the truth. If you walked all the way from a 5:28 p.m. nod to a rain-soaked return of a whistle that only dogs can hear, thank you. Some frequencies only resolve when another person is still willing to stand in the drizzle and listen for what cannot be proven in advance. If these pages sat with you, leave a like so I know the park bench was shared. Subscribe if you want the next one. And if you feel like speaking, tell me about a signal you once pretended not to notice, and what it finally cost you to admit you had been waiting too. I read every word. The silver whistle lives on my keyring now. Some evenings, when the light drops early and the oaks turn the color of old briefs, I lift it and give one short, soundless breath. Winston and Barnaby turn. Occasionally, Avery turns with them. We do not always walk the same direction afterward. We simply no longer pretend. The call was never sent.